Good evening and welcome to Bentham House, home of the Faculty of Laws at University College London. For those I've not yet met, I'm Stephen Vaughan. I'm the Vice Dean of the Faculty and Professor of Law and Professional Ethics. So we come together in person and online to debate a complex and challenging question: can law firms have values? So as many of you here will already know, there are about 300,000 people who work in legal services in England and Wales in almost 10,000 law firms. And those lawyers and their firms do a real wide variety of work. They counsel individuals at their most vulnerable moments. They affect multi-billion-pound transactions all over the world. Those lawyers and their law firms have a real variety of legal, societal, and economic impacts. Now, the independence of those lawyers and their law firms can sometimes see legal service providers thought to be acting as neutral intermediaries between their client and the state. And if that's right, and there is that professional independence, that might then be thought to curtail the agency of those lawyers and their firms to form and express views on pressing issues of the day. Now, is that right? Can lawyers and law firms have opinions? Can they have values? And if they can, how can they then give voice to those values? Now, I should say that we prepared this event some time ago and before the invasion of Ukraine, which obviously is relevant to this evening's conversation. And so over the next hour, Sarah De Gay, visiting professor at the faculty, among her many other titles and accolades, and I are going to explore that challenging question: can law firm have values, with our panel of experts? And we're very much hoping that you'll engage with us in that conversation. So there'll be a panel discussion followed by a Q&A. Those in the room can raise their hands, and for those joining us online, there is a Q&A function, and I'll be looking at those questions later on. Let me hand over to Sarah now to introduce our panelists.
Before I introduce our three panelists who I'm very excited about, I should just make the point that they are each from completely different sectors, and only one of them, no prizes for guessing which one, is a lawyer. So this is not this is not simply a happy accident. We've consciously gone out there and sought contributors from outside of law firms as well as inside the sector, and that isn't just to get a range of perspectives, but it's also to see if there could be learnings for law firms from others. So that point made, we welcome in the middle of the sofa here Sue Garrard, who is a leading sustainability strategist, chair of trustees of the independent not-for-profit A Blueprint for Better Business, who I'm sure many of you will have heard of and come across, and former EVP of Sustainable Business and Communications at Unilever. We'll be inviting her during the course of the evening to talk to us about mayonnaise, madness, and lots of other things. On Sue's left, we have Dr. Henrietta Hughes, OBE, who was until recently the NHS's National Guardian, which is quite some job title, isn't it? Responsible for making speaking up business as usual across the whole of the NHS following the Francis inquiry. And then on Sue's right, we have Jeff Twentyman, last but absolutely by no means least. He is a corporate and mergers and acquisitions partner at Magic Circle law firm Slaughter & May, and is also its head of sustainability. So really lucky to have such a highly skilled and experienced panel here. And we could sort of speak all evening about their credentials, but I've kept it to a minimum because I'm keen to kind of get on to our first theme. And no surprises that in very lawyerly fashion, we're going to start with some definitions here. What are values? So Sue, I know you're not a lawyer, but when I ask lawyers about values in this context and what values they have and their firm have, they often refer to their integrity. Is that a value, do you think?
Yeah, so thank you for that. And I don't know how many of you feel you could trot straight off an accurate definition of values. I couldn't. So fortunately, I got some warning that I was going to field that question. I went and looked it up. And fortunately, most of the sources that I looked at said the same thing, which is that it's basically the set of beliefs that you hold either individually or collectively, really in any social construct, that actually govern the way that you behave. And when I looked at the integrity question, that was a kind of sort of half in, half out. So strictly speaking, the definitions of values don't include integrity. But the definition of integrity, bear with me, is having strong moral principles and being honest. And when you look at what moral principles are, they're the same as values. And the top one that's listed on every site I could come across was honesty. So I think really what this shows is that it's very easy to get trapped in all those definitions. But I think my view is you apply a big old dollop of common sense. And generally speaking, I think most people know what we're talking about. It's the things that guide you when no one's looking. I thought was the nicest phrase, common phrase to really define that. So I would say in spirit, integrity is in the mix.
Henrietta, do you agree with that? Can you tell us what your job is, NHS National Guardian, well, briefly, of course, and then just move on. Are values the things which guide you, guiding principles when no one else is looking?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. So if I just very briefly talk about my role as National Guardian, you may have heard of a trust in the Midlands called Mid-Staffs, where a whole series of catastrophic failures happened, not just in the organisation, but in the whole regulatory framework. And hundreds of patients died needlessly. And the question was raised, what were the doctors doing? What were the nurses doing? Why didn't anyone raise these concerns? And the reality was that people had tried to speak up and they hadn't been listened to and the right actions hadn't been taken. So Sir Robert Francis was asked to do a public inquiry. And as part of that, he found that people had tried to speak up. But actually, it wasn't just at Mid-Staffs where the problems were. It was across the whole of the NHS, going back decades, that where people were trying to speak up, they felt that there was fear that they'd be victimised or that it was futile, that nothing would happen as a result. So a recommendation was made that every trust in England should have a freedom to speak up guardian, somebody that you could go to in confidence, that would escalate matters on your behalf, that would give you support and would follow up, and then a national guardian to lead that network. And just thinking about the scale of 1.3 million in the NHS, and then the rest of the health sector, including the national bodies and the private organisations, it was an enormous scale. And over the time that I was National Guardian, we had over 50,000 cases raised with 700 guardians across England and broader as well. And going back to the question, what I would say is it's not about trying to get people to speak up. It's about having a culture which is led by people who have those values that foster a culture where people could speak up. And you have to have speaking up, listening up, and following up. So integrity is a really important part of that. But one of the things that people are very acutely aware of is when you have stated values that don't actually then match the behaviours of leaders. So when leaders are stating values, and it's all on the corporate letterheads, on the walls, or everywhere else, but then there's a mismatch, people see that immediately, and I call that the say-do gap. So I think it is definitely right to have values, but if you're going to have values, you have to live them as well.
Jeff, I'm going to link values of regulation, given that we're both lawyers. So Sarah's already referenced integrity. We have the SRA Code of Conduct approach to regulation. Integrity is in there as one of the principles, along with honesty, independence, rule of law, client best interest, etc. So couldn't we argue that the SRA has already given law firms a set of values? They are the things in the principles. And actually for law firms to be doing their own thing, to be creating their own values, is either unnecessary or perhaps even unprofessional.
Well, we could, but I think the question, there's an implicit question in the question whether law firms can have values really is whether those values are adequate, isn't it? Because of course the answer to the question is yes, we can have values, but Sue illustrated the notion of integrity is a little bit wishy-washy. No one really knows what integrity means. Is it honesty? Is it good professional conduct? What's good professional conduct? They're very circular, these concepts. And the simple answer is yes, of course, law firms can have values, but are they good enough? And which is, to answer that question, you have to ask the question, are you satisfied with the role that law firms play in our society? Is it okay for law firms simply to be, the oily rag that makes the engine work? Or is it actually a whole product that has to stand and justify itself as an economic activity in its own right? It comes back to your opening remark about whether it's law firms are separate from their clients or whether they're really just a facilitator or enabler of client objectives. So I think, to my mind, the question is more about adequacy and morals, really. Again, morals I recognise is a very loose term, but I think that's really what's the heart of the question for me.
And I think maybe we can open up to the whole panel. So if we're thinking about the agency of law firms, and we have these regulatory principles, independence, integrity, etc., do we think law firms are special? Are they in a special category? We're speaking out on things like climate change or on more political issues like Brexit. Does that put them in a distinct category compared to other professions or other occupations? Sue, do you want to?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's quite a big leap in the question, just to acknowledge it, first of all, from can they have values to what do they say in public? And the two aren't necessarily, you don't have to have one without the other. But I think really what's underneath the question is, how should law firms make choices about who they work with? And is it enough in today's world simply to say that their purpose is to do two things: to make a profit for whoever owns them, usually the shareholders, which are part of the partners, and to enable everybody to have fair access to the law so they can do their work in a way that the law enables and allows? And it won't surprise you to hear from me, I think that's wholly inadequate in today's society. I think it doesn't chime with the way that numbers of people in society are actually feeling. I think we face, irrespective of the horrors of Ukraine, we face existential issues on the planet, and we face an operating environment in business where law is an enabler of individuals and business, where for me, there are some additional questions other than simply have they complied with the list of principles that were captured on a piece of paper. I honestly don't know when, but we all know. In fact, I have worked on a draft piece of legislation in government 400 years ago, and the link between what you stick on the piece of paper and what actually happens in practice is very significant and very difficult to capture. And personally, I feel that there needs to be a real sense of choice made by particularly major leading law organisations about a belief set that really drives them. Are they really agnostic about everything that's happening in the world? Almost impossible to believe, isn't it?
Henrietta, is there anything you'd like to add to that?
Yeah, so I was thinking about it in terms of, we were looking at the standards and principles, and I was curious about how they were formulated, who was involved in making them, because my experience is that if you have an organisation of any size, to impose a set of values from the top down never works. It really needs to be produced through many conversations. And I was thinking about, in the audience here, we've got students, and when you come into a profession, and I know this from medical students because I'm a doctor, that people generally will come in with all the right reasons, and I just wonder over time if that sort of gets diluted a little bit, and whether what the opportunity is to stay really current and bring in the thoughts and ideas of the youngest and the most junior people perhaps in the organisation, because that's actually what the future is going to look like, and probably creates a more sustainable way of working for organisations. We know the Kodak moment, if you don't move with the times, then it's all going to go horribly wrong. So I would be really interested, not just in the views of the partners, but actually of everybody in the organisation. And when leaders are genuinely interested in the views of people in their organisation, in my view, that is what good leadership is.
It's interesting, you sort of almost touched on this idea of values being a democratic decision within a law firm. I'm not convinced that many law firms are run as democracies, however. I mean, so you've referenced partners and their interest in profit. So, of course, law firms are a people business, and lots of people that work in law firms who aren't partners. Sometimes those lawyers are referred to units of production, in fact. To what extent do you think those lawyers should be allowed to bring their kind of personal values to work? And should those, in fact, help to shape the values and culture of the law firm they're working at? Or is it just too much to expect there to be that sort of professional, personal alignment, do you think?
you want me to go on that
Yeah.
one as well?
Yeah, oh, and maybe your experience at Unilever, I'm thinking
Yeah.
in particular, might help.
Well,
as
and
well.
also fundamentally what we believe at Blueprint is that, you know, you either have a very linear view of work, which is it's an organisation which function is to make profit, and people are there in order to deliver the needs of the organisation. But I think that doesn't bear first contact with the real world. But more fundamentally, I think there's something about the dignity of the individual that they bring to their work, almost always a desire to do something well and to have meaning in their life. And if you think how much time we spend at work compared with almost anything else we do in our lives, surely what most of us want is to choose to have a life well led, which is a life with meaning, which in some way is a life of service. And I don't mean that in the narrow sense, I mean it in the widest sense. And I think it's actually impossible to separate the individual and their values from the organisation that they work in. And it's very unhealthy to seek to suppress them. It's much more powerful if you can connect with people at the level of their own values and find ways of connecting those. Because, you know, as an ex-senior leader at Unilever, I always used to say, in response to constant moaning about we haven't got enough time to do our work, and you know, it hands up anybody who feels they've got enough time to do what they want to do. Nobody, right? Hurrah, one man, you're a brave man. Long may it continue, may I say. But what we have, which is really elastic, is energy. And what happens when your work is connected with your values and has meaning is that you operate with great energy. And we all know, don't we? You approach something that you've got to do, it's on your to-do list, and back to the unitary value of one person contributing in a shareholder primacy organisation. It can take you forever to do something in a very average way. When you unlock people's energy, it is just remarkable what they can achieve. So I find it extraordinary to even think that you would want people to suppress their values. I certainly don't think it's a healthy state for any long-term organisation.
Henrietta, has there been impacted by COVID, do you think, increased working from home, this sort of match of personal values and organisational values?
Well, I was just thinking, I love the way you described that. And I there's a Japanese concept of ikigai, yeah, which is that alignment of your mission, your vision, your values, your behaviour. And that is the sort of dream state, isn't it? And I think one of the things that we were just talking earlier before the panel about what it's like to be a GP in COVID and post-COVID and living with COVID. And actually it does inhibit the ability to work in a you know, that kind of nirvana state, because you know that there's a massive mismatch between supply and demand, and I think it is incredibly draining if you're, you know, having to do some work which doesn't align with your values. So I think it's not good business sense if you're in a profit-making organisation, but it also over a very long period of time, I think it actually impacts on people's health and well-being as well. So I think if we want to keep people healthy and well, and really doing their very best, then being able for individuals to work in a way which suits their values is absolutely key.
Jeff, I wonder if is it any different for lawyers? So one of the many reasons that I like you, and one of the reasons we've asked you this evening, is because you're not afraid to say what you feel. And at the same time, you're a very, very well respected, very well known corporate lawyer. You know, I'm thinking in the last 12 months, that piece you wrote at COP26 about climate change. And so I wonder if you can share with us if there have been moments where your personal views have conflicted with your kind of client tasks or what your clients would want of you. And if that has happened, how you've managed to resolve those tensions or those conflicts.
Well, it's happened a lot, actually. If I can segue from what we were just talking about there through to that question, I mean, I was interested in becoming a lawyer when I was a teenager because I had read some books which gave me a very strong sense of justice, and I was interested in justice in simplistic terms being fairness of outcomes and fairness of treatment of people. And so my motivation to get into the law was that idea that I'd be working in a system that delivered fair outcomes to people. And I think what happens as a junior lawyer, and I should just pause to recognise that we're carrying on this conversation as if all law firms are the same. And that really isn't true. There's more than one industrial sector in law. We're talking about big law firms, because there's no question that there are small law firms who are absolutely motivated by purpose and values and morals. But in the big law firm world that I've worked in, you sort of get there and you're so happy that you've got a job that you actually focus on the system rather than the thing that got you there in the first place, and refining your ability to deliver the service, if you like, which is a procedural rather than a substantive issue. And that becomes your absolute ambition, to become better and better at processing. And that's what law firms do. And I think law firms have forgotten the idea of justice and purpose, because competition and scale has driven them to refining in a sort of industrialized way what their service for clients is, because that's what they get paid for. So coming then to your question, there have been times when I've sat in rooms with people who I've been revolted by. Their opinions have absolutely appalled me. And, sometimes I've sort of, left the meeting and made light of it, because the system doesn't allow you to think that you, as the service provider, are legitimate in having that sort of view. But of course, it comes back to some of these principles of professional conduct. How do you advise somebody if, in fact, you don't even respect them? How can you deal with that? And in my firm, there have been moments when some of my partners, we have a very entrepreneurial atmosphere where partners can bring in work, and as long as it passes various tests of propriety and probity, we don't inhibit those sorts of choices. But I'll give you an example. This is long in the past. I know my GC is sitting in the audience, so she's going to wince when I say this, but it was before her time as well. But when we were asked to advise the World Wrestling Federation bringing a trademark infringement against the World Wildlife Fund, and I said, we simply cannot take this piece of work on. And I was the only one who objected to it. And that's not because nobody cares, it's because nobody thinks it's okay to care. They think the system is what they're working in. And so it's very difficult. And I encourage, it's not an answer to this question to say, if you were principled and you saw a piece of work that made you unhappy, you would leave. Because, that sort of absolutist approach to principle is not the real world. We all live in a spectrum of compromise of our principles. But I think the legal profession, I think the regulator, I think the law society has completely fallen asleep in this question of alignment. It's not just about personal values with what your business does, but what your business is doing in comparison to the public need. And that piece that you referred to that I wrote at COP26 was arguing for there to be a public interest obligation as well. That actually you should deploy the very considerable capacity and resources that we have in major law firms with the intention of serving the public interest. And again, that simply doesn't happen. Did I say it straight enough for you?
Pretty much. Thanks, Jeff. It's also wincing, so it's obviously a good job.
Yeah.
Not from me. It's absolutely spot on.
Can I go all compliancy on you, Jeff?
Yeah. Oh God, I'm in trouble.
I think I already know the answer to this question, or at least what you're going to say, but it's interesting the example you just used actually. But is it okay for a lawyer to say that they're revolted by a client, or maybe a particular piece of work that a client wants them to do, and to solve that problem by kind of passing the work onto a colleague down the corridor who doesn't feel individually constrained in that way? What does that do for the organisation, do you think? Can that work?
I think for organisations that don't make those sorts of choices, it deals with the misalignment of personal interest, so it makes it manageable. And when I say I was revolted, I mean there are positions that you can serve clients with integrity and honesty and avoiding avoiding conflicts, fully in compliance with your professional obligations, and yet know that what you're doing is assisting in an outcome that does not make you in any way happy on the moral spectrum. And I think, you should actually recuse yourself from doing that sort of work for on the grounds of personal conflict or personal misalignment of interest. But unfortunately, the system doesn't really encourage that sort of thinking. It sort of makes you think, and this is where I come back to the point I made, that when you arrive bushy-tailed and interested in justice, the system says, well, that's all very interesting, but please can you do this piece of work for the next 30 years? And you don't think about those interests anymore. And I'm now at the stage of my career where I've got more time to think about it. And I can sort of remember those things that motivated me in the first place. But actually the legal profession is populated largely by young people making their way in the world, financially insecure, not looking for sympathy for them, but they're not necessarily motivated by the bigger picture at that stage. And as I say, the system doesn't really encourage that sort of debate. So, I know where you're going with your point, but the reality is that big organizations don't make those moral choices at this stage.
Yeah, and I think a regulator probably also takes quite a narrow view of what a personal conflict is.
Absolutely,
so
yeah.
It's very much associated with the pecuniary. So if you've got an economic interest in your client, or you're related to a board member, or whatever it is, but not necessarily a sort of a moral mismatch, as it were. So on the subject of money, Sue, and profitability, I mean, there are lots of people out there that would say that actually law firms make a huge contribution because they're very profitable businesses who pay their taxes. And actually, if they start to get very choosy about what work they do and which clients they're going to represent, then maybe that will negatively impact on their profitability, and that will be to the detriment of all of us.
Okay, I'll give you the polite version back. So, you just think about reputation, and how delicate a thing that is and how critical it is, really actually in any organisation, but particularly in a law firm. I'd just make a couple of observations, both in the context of my time at Unilever and now that I'm outside it, doing work on my own and work with Blueprint. And that is pretty simply that increasingly organisations, whether they're law firms or anything else, are judged by the company that they keep. And that increasingly, actually, major organisations will not work with suppliers, whether they're law firms or they're selling you palm oil. They don't distinguish between those two increasingly, unless they share those same values. And I can tell you very concretely from my time at Unilever, when I was on the four-man team that dealt with the Kraft Heinz hostile bid, which was absolutely unadulterated hell. But we had some very difficult conversations with all of the organisations that were going to be supporting us in a very, very short space of time, because as some of you may know, once you've gone over a week in a hostile bid, basically the ratchet effect of the value of the bid goes up to the point where the directors say, we've got no choice, we've got to recommend it to the board of directors. So you're in the most intense pressure cooker you could possibly be, and you're trying to choose suppliers who are sympathetic to you. And in that situation, we couldn't quite get fully over the line with our full choice of suppliers, but wherever we could, we said, we want to work with organisations that share our broader objectives, one of which is to decouple economic activity from negative environmental impact. We're definitely not going to work with organisations and give them large amounts of money for the fees. Some of you again may know in that kind of hostile bid work are eye-watering. Not going to fund organisations who are working actively against our objectives as a PLC, even in the situation of a hostile bid. And then for almost all cases, we actually managed to operate that filter, but it was incredibly difficult. And what was even more difficult was that quite a lot of the suppliers, lawyers, bankers, blah, 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 PR agencies looked at us and were like, why are you asking us this? And that was in 2017. I would imagine that the world has changed quite significantly since then. What I can definitely tell you is quite a lot of the bigger organisations are now having as a target and a public position that they will not work with any supplier that doesn't fit with that. So I think profitability will get hit unless legal organisations start to think about what they stand for. And again, this is about the choices that you make and values that go beyond that list of the 7 and look at the existential issues that we face. And I certainly, down to the tiniest point of all the organisations that I deal with, because I understand what's happening to our planet, which will very quickly become unlivable unless we make some very significant choices. I simply will not work with organisations that are not actively trying to be part of the solution. And young people in particular feel very strongly about that. So I think profitability will be much more damaged for organisations that don't start to take a position.
What do you think about that, Jeff, in relation to law firms? So if law firms are speaking publicly about their values, imagine, for example, a firm publicly says something about the rule of law in Hong Kong. Is that likely to lead to an impact on business or potential business in China?
Quite possibly, yeah, quite possibly. And you know, this is the traditional debate around this subject. Is, you know, on the one hand, you know, a law firm like mine, it's a substantial business with, you know, lots of revenues, lots of expenses. We don't have any sort of free pass for the, you know, the demands of a social license to operate that every other business is responding to in our current time. So, you know, the fact that we're a B2B business means that we don't have the sort of same sort of consumer aspect, but it's perfectly possible for us, if we take, if you like, a principled position on things, to you know, cause consternation to some of our clients. And it's a complicated geopolitical world out there. You know, you'll probably find on every major law firm's website that they think that the rule of law is an important sustainable development goal. But actually, where are the law firms putting their hands up and seeking to defend the rule of law? I mean, let alone Hong Kong, even in this country. And we have a government that is taking some very illiberal steps. We have a regulator who has voiced concerns about some of those. But it doesn't suit commercially an organisation, a commercial organisation, particularly one that may see the prospect of gaining mandates from government, to criticise government. And so, you know, for me, that sort of issue there comes back to a question of integrity, because are you displaying integrity collectively if you say that you believe in the Sustainable Development Goals as a framework for society and business within it, but you don't stand up and say, well, hang on a second, that seems to be something where I can have an opinion, but I'm not going to express an opinion. That doesn't feel to me like being consistent with integrity, not to have that voice. But you know, we live in an imperfect world, and you know, all businesses are having to wrestle with these really quite complicated issues. And you know, you mentioned Ukraine earlier, and without actually getting into the detail of that posed all sorts of difficult, complex moral issues for businesses. Do you run away from your business in Russia? What's the impact on your employees over there? Is it causing more harm than good? You know, it's not straightforward. You know, the press like to see these as straightforward issues, but they're not. The best thing you can do, I think, to hope for is that you actually actively consider them and make a principled decision about them.
Have the conversation.
Yeah.
I think that's really interesting that both Sue and you, Jeff, have kind of almost touched on the idea of clients as backdoor regulators, and we can return to that in a moment. But I just wanted to ask Henrietta first about organisational values possibly fueling employee grievances, and whether that could be to the detriment of the business's profitability and just its ability to kind of keep going. if you've got published values, does that mean that, you know, inevitably you're going to get more employees challenging decisions that their organisation makes, and is that a bad thing?
See, I would actually see it as a good thing, because I think, again, it opens up the eyes and the ears of the people at the top as to what it's actually like to work in that organisation. Because people who are very senior believe that it's really easy to speak up in the organisation, and people who are really junior believe that leaders aren't very good at listening. And that's been shown by Professor Megan Reitz across many different sectors. And so you know, the people on the panel here, we'll probably think, well, we're really good at listening, but the people who work for us, what is it like to be on the receiving end of us? You know, it's a very different experience. And I think that what happens is that you can actually identify problems earlier on, you can fix them, you build more engagement with your staff as well, particularly if, when people raise things, you know, do the right thing and you act on it in a timely way and the outcomes are fair. But I also think it then becomes a draw to people who care about how they're treated, and you're probably more likely to attract talent, maybe get less you know, problems with retention and recruitment. And we know that at the moment, just turning up to work, people who turn up should be kind of congratulated, because that's a big problem. But I do think it's a generational shift, because actually the sort of natural tendency is to kind of clam up, and, you know, the walls to kind of come down, and for leaders to isolate themselves. So I think it's about being courageous. I was also going to say that I think we've got a lot of history in this country of organisations starting up on the basis of moral values. And I think that says a lot about what we are as, or would like to be maybe, and that the law as a profession is an anchor institution, and the world is changing, but I think the world could change quicker and better if the organisations actually were courageous enough to say, well, these are the things that we care about, and we're going to lead in that direction. And I'm interested in, as a kind of profession, what people, you know, really want from their career.
Jeff, having listened to what Henrietta's just said, what do you think is the upside, or what are the upsides for a law firm in doing more to encourage the kind of voicing of concerns, of people coming to you and saying, actually, I don't think this is consistent with our values, I have an issue here?
Well, I think we touched on it a little bit earlier, and I think, you know, law firms are a people business, and, you know, the cliche description of a people business is that the most valuable assets go up and down the lift. But law firms don't think like that at all. Law firms think their most valuable assets are their clients, which sort of says it all, really. It's a sort of, you know, misunderstanding of where the real value is. And you know, I think you get much more out of people if they know why they're doing something and feel that it's worthwhile, and which is purpose, which we're not really talked about here. But you know, if anybody asks me to do something, the first thing I want to know is why I'm doing it, because it informs the way I perform the task, and it informs my motivation. And, you know, I think, you know, it's a simplistic example, but I think it's also true for young people, young professionals. If they think that what they're doing is a worthy cause, they will work harder. You'll get better engagement, you'll get better value through that. And I think, you know, the other thing which we tend to approach this subject, you know, as a sort of a negative, as a criticism. There's a massive opportunity here as well. You know, what we see now is the legal profession is a really effective tool of vested interest in the status quo. That's what it's doing. It's serving the system and the power distribution that is currently in the system. Well, it could also do completely the opposite. It could be a tool for disruption and the transformation of the economy. And funnily enough, we happen to need a transformation of the economy. So the opportunity here for law firms is actually to be on the side of the transformers and the businesses of the future, and actually helping business. And, you know, just to be clear, all of the clients I work for regularly, all of them absolutely get the need to transform their business. They want to do it. There's nobody sitting there thinking, right, if I do this, I can get away with it. I don't have to do that. Nobody thinks like that. They may have different levels of information and different understanding of their capacity to affect change, but everybody wants to do it. So actually, law firms and the legal industry could see itself as a positive force for change, and actually, if you like, disentangle itself a little bit from the system and start inventing the new system that we need, which would be hugely motivating for people, I think, and actually would bring this issue perfectly into line.
To say something about that, just to build on it. So, if you look at where we are now with the effects of capitalism, with law firms operating as kind of something that oils the wheels of part of that, it's really very good at generating wealth. It's really very bad at distributing that wealth in anything like an equitable way. By the way, equitable, I think, is one of the principles. And, we have the SDGs, all 17 of them, too many is the cop-out. We have now science that says that unless we decarbonize at a certain rate, we have quite a lot of insights about the fact that what got us here will not get us there, really, just building on Jeff's point. And I think that, very intelligent, well-educated people, which people are as they come into law, are likely to be asking themselves some pretty profound questions. We know this is happening in all sorts of disciplines and career choices about what cause they're going to serve. And I come back to that word in the broadest sense. And, I think to believe that we're going to get another generation that will come into that and simply say, and I love the way Jeff has brought it to life, that you come in with a very clear sense of what role you want to play in society, and actually then the process kind of swallows you up. Very synthesized version of what Jeff has said. Who wants to spend 40 years of their life now with what the world is facing? Probably, in my view, the most volatile period that we've had since the Second World War. And looking forward, the thought, for example, about working on a case for a company that is not committed to net zero and isn't taking action, unthinkable. I mean, if any of you listened to Antonio Gutierrez's comments after the last IPCC report in April, if you blanked over the name at the bottom, you would think it was Greta Thunberg speaking, but it wasn't. It was Antonio saying, basically, the world of business, and within that I include the major players in the legal profession, are at risk now of being complicit and lying to the detriment of the livability of this one planet. And I really, if that doesn't jolt us out of our complacency about the pursuit of maximizing profit being fundamentally flawed, it's about that having to be an outcome from serving society in a more profound way. And I'm talking generally, but including the legal profession within that, and to making choices based on the information we have about what integrity and equality really means in today's world, then we're just kidding ourselves.
Maybe I can follow on. Henrietta, did you want to come in?
Yeah, I was just going to say that I see it as like a social movement, and certainly in the health sector, you come in with I'm going to help make speaking up business as usual, and then you put up your Kevlar kind of armor, because actually it's deeply unpopular, and then you find that there are allies, and actually I would see everyone sitting in the room and online as allies this evening. You're here because you think maybe you do think that values are a good thing in a law firm. And actually what happens is when you have events like this and you start talking about it, then people start thinking it is possible. We could do it. Actually, I feel better now. And I think that's very uplifting. And I would really encourage to say, take this concept back to your teams, your organizations, and continue the conversation, because that's what makes the social movement grow. And you look back, maybe 5 years time and think, yeah, we now have values and I feel happier. And I think that for me is a really important part of this. It's not just about what we say on the panel, it's what it leads to and the change that it then sparks in the way that you do your business. I think that's really key.
I think that's what we thought about this evening, kind of starting the conversation. And I'm not sure we would have had this panel or this conversation 5 years ago. Definitely not 10 years ago. It just wouldn't have happened. So I want to come back to something you said, thinking about sort of profit and drivers for change. Most law firms are partner owned, which puts them, in quite a different position to large corporations, that aren't investors in the same sort of way. And I wonder, there's a big debate isn't about the extent to which investors can actually shape decision making or kind of change inside corporates. But I wonder, do you think the fact that most law firms are partner owned, is that a good thing or a bad thing?
Well, I think there's two bits to your question, really. One is, how do you get consensus amongst partners? Seems to me like a bunch of ferrets in a sack, but anyway, Jeff's probably better in a better position to comment on that, although he may choose not to. So that would be one aspect. But I think really the broader point is the investor the only stakeholder that can drive a change in behaviours, choices? So I keep coming back to the word choices because it's an active word. What choices does the organisation make about how it's run, what work it does, what work it doesn't do? And there are lots of stakeholders that are placing leverage, however subtly or not. And I think that will grow, to your point about we would have had this conversation 10 years ago. So, investors, people who invest in the firm are not just the classic City PLC investors. You have people that are investing every day of their time in the organisation. And I think you only have to look at what happened to McKinsey's, 1,100 people writing an open letter to the New York Times saying, we don't work for you anymore because actually you're happy to work with clients that are going to finish our planet off, and quite a lot of them actually resigned. So they're saying, we're not going to invest our time in you. You have, as I've talked about before, you have clients who are very powerful. We're going to invest a large amount of money so you can win this. Well, we're going to make a choice about where that money is going to go. And I could give you a much longer list of investors. So I think there are lots of pressures, and I see those, it's muddy. And again, there's to quote your phrase, in some cases, as I say, do get, and there's some virtue signalling. Well, all change is messy, isn't it? It's not a nice, neat curve. But I think we're seeing more and more of those lead indicators that say, increasingly, as organisations are held to account, transparency grows, and we see the state of the world, that there will be those choices made by all sorts of other investors, and that will put pressure on partnerships. Quite how you resolve the ferrets in a sack problem, I defer to other people that have worked in that environment, and I haven't. Jeff's hoping it doesn't get thrown to him.
I'm going to move away from ferrets and onto mayonnaise, Jeff. Okay. I'm just looking at our audience. I don't know if you're all familiar with the mayonnaise madness story from earlier this year, but Sue, maybe this is a good point at which to educate us all. And if you could let us know whether you think that attempts by businesses to become more purposeful, including law firms, is just sort of too woke and passing.
Yeah, well, I have to say I hate the word woke because it's a pejorative, slightly meaningless catch-all. So I personally don't use it, but I recognise that lots of critics do. So for those that are not familiar, in a nutshell, a very significant investor of Unilever, bearing in mind I haven't worked there for 3 years, so I'm not kind of speaking as its employed advocate anymore, but one of its biggest investors criticised it very publicly, which is not really the done thing with big investors. It's better to go to the organisation privately first, and said, look, you're too worried about all this sustainability malarkey, and I think he called it woke. And, why on earth Hellman's was a perfectly good brand. Everybody knows what Hellman's is for, after all, isn't it? You stick it on your salads and your potatoes or whatever. Why does it suddenly have to have a purpose? This is all rubbish. And by the way, can you please concentrate on improving the health of the business? And this was at a point where the share price was looking rocky, and it's stabilised, but it hasn't got back up. And so first of all, the specifics on Hellman's. So Hellman's has been repositioned as a brand that tries to help families avoid food waste. And food waste is a really big issue because it's a huge waste of money, you've got families that have got very significant income constraints, which are going to get a lot worse. It's a shocking waste of the resources of the planet. Over a third of all the food that is grown and produced is wasted and thrown away. We could feed people very bounteously if we didn't have that problem. And it's grown the brand. So the brand grew 4 times faster than the average brand at Unilever, and it grew faster because it was actually helping people make their money go further and make intelligent choices about what they had in their fridge. And that's a purpose-led brand. So first of all, Terry Smith was completely wrong that being purposeful made it a more powerful, relevant brand to the people who bought it and used it. And indeed, that's true because this is the work I led personally at Unilever across the suite of several of our biggest brands that became purpose-led, which all outgrew the rest of the brand portfolio by anything from 200 to 600%, which is pretty much unheard of for a mature brand in a mature business. But the underlying point really is this a distraction? And what you find increasingly is that when you work in a business that says the purpose of this business or this brand is to deliver this benefit to society, you problem solve in a completely different way. Doesn't mean to say you don't have to make your margin and your profit targets along the way. It's not as if you suddenly turn into a charity, you're still a business. But when you navigate towards a solution, which is you've got to deliver 3% margin in the next 3 months, that's the only thing that you think about. That's your North Star. When you say to people, this food brand, as we did with another one with Knorr, is going to actually help maternal mothers who can barely afford food in sub-Saharan Africa to avoid very, very high levels of malnourishment that led to premature infant death because of the absence of several key minerals, which we could put into our Knorr products, not increase the price, train midwives and medics in the area, create a sales network that gave these mothers access. That became the purpose of that Knorr brand in Africa. And suddenly the whole team, so what I was saying about energy levels earlier, they felt deeply connected with the role of that brand because they knew they were going to save babies' lives, you know, and of course they met the 3% margin. In fact, they were more determined than ever to do that because that gave them the permission to do the work they really cared about. But their lateral problem solving was at a completely different level. So, you know, my personal experience of this, and then subsequently as chair of Blueprint, is that if you can sharply define the purpose and then you use it to drive choices, the theme I keep coming back to in here, it's an incredibly powerful way of delivering something meaningful, unlocking the energy of people, becoming a magnet for talent as a business. And if you do that well, you deliver profit. And every stakeholder of the business, including shareholders, benefit from that. Why wouldn't you want that?
I think that might be a good point at which to stop this conversation and open up for questions from the audience. We have, I think, about 7 minutes. And for those who are online, please do feel free to put your questions into the Q&A box. I'll take a question from the back first. Jose.
Hi. Thank you. Very interesting conversation. I felt that maybe I missed it, but I didn't hear if you have an opinion on what role does maybe law schools play in forming the values that eventually the young lawyers that are going to be working in these firms. Because, for instance, here I'm an LLM student and I'm in environmental law, and we're like 20, and you know we definitely have values, and we're going to work in hopefully in very nice organizations, but we're not the only ones, and there's another big part of the programs that are probably more focused on corporate or things, and I'm not judging, but you know there's a divide, you know, and how what role must law schools play in this whole process?
Thank you, Jose. It's a very good question. Yes, Henrietta.
Yeah, I mean, I think that being a student is an amazing time in your life because you have time in a way that you probably wouldn't do, you know, when you're working flat out. But the other thing I would say is it's about forming networks and influencing and bringing the passion and the excitement that made you choose, you know, the type of law that you're studying. So that you then become a kind of ambassador for that, so that your friends and your contemporaries who might be going into slightly kind of maybe drier, you know, areas of law could bring that same kind of the values and the goals and the objectives into the workplaces that they go into. But also, you know, when you go into a workplace, when you've graduated, there's something about sort of injecting that energy, you know, into a group of people who may have that energy levels, but may not. And I think that's for me is the you know the great fun thing about, and also you're at UCL, so you're mixing with people across the piece, with, you know, and so you'll be learning also from all of their different. So I think it's something about the networking, but maintaining that energy and how you, not just for yourself, but for those around you as well.
Mm-hmm. I'll just a couple of other thoughts. And it comes back to something I said earlier, which is that I think the legal training infrastructure needs to keep its eye on the motives for people coming into the system. And unfortunately, it's become it's deregulated in the sense that it's now a commercial proposition to put people through law school, regardless of whether there are good jobs for those legal graduates. The emphasis is entirely, really, certainly in the sector of law that I work in, on producing people who are going to be good at the job. And there's no connection with that, your motives for studying environmental law. An awful lot of people who study environmental law go on to protect people, companies and businesses that have done terrible environmental things. Very few of them go and act for NGOs. So something happens between that spark of motivation to study that subject and the practical reality. And that's because the system is basically putting sausage meat in one end and producing sausages at the other end. The sausages are the lawyers. They're well-trained, highly efficient, highly effective lawyers who've lost sight of why they were in this. I come back to my notion that actually we all need to remember what our role is in society is, what our role in contributing to the public good should be. But unfortunately, our system currently doesn't do that.
It's quite hard, isn't it, as an applicant that hasn't really worked within the law to research the values and understand them of the different employers, isn't it? Because I think if you looked at websites, they all look exactly the same.
Yeah.
And we have, of course, got at the moment this kind of war for the best associate talent, and predictably it's kind of being fought with checkbooks, isn't it? So salaries are going up and up. I mean, does salary motivate you? Are you, when you're making judgments about who you're going to work for, are you looking at what they're paying their NQs and thinking, oh, maybe American firms are now paying more than Magic Circles, that's the way I'm going to go? And I'm just interested what.
Well, I mean, one of the questions we inevitably ask people in an interview for their first job in a law firm is, why do you want to be a commercial lawyer? It's not what interests you in law. Why do you want to be a commercial lawyer? Those are completely different questions.
Mm-hmm. But I think, you know, Jose, you're kind of at the base of your question is a real challenge for us as law school educators to kind of think about purpose and values. We don't do that very often. We teach in disciplinary blocks. We're all kind of great experts in our own fields. I said to you at the beginning, I'm a professor of law and professional ethics. I'm one of two in the whole country. That's it. You know, professional ethics isn't taught at the undergraduate level, generally in the UK. It's a really good, the question is a really good challenge for us, and one we'll take away. I'm going to look at some of the questions online, simply because those in the audience will have a chance to engage in conversation at drinks afterwards. And here's a very good question, I think, for the whole panel. How can we create a culture where lawyers or others feel able to speak up and align their firms and values? How do firms encourage this and deal with it? Henrietta, I wonder if you might start with that, given your experience of getting people to speak up.
So I would flip it, and it's about leaders fostering the right environment. That's a purposeful decision. It doesn't happen by accident. And when I was National Guardian, we measured the speak up culture according to the staff survey results. And there's a question that's now in the staff survey result, not just for all NHS organisations, but also for some of the national bodies as well. I feel safe to speak up about anything in my organisation. So we're talking about psychological safety, and that's not created by the workforce, it's created by the leadership and the management. So how do you get it to happen? Well, in the highest performing organisations, the ones who saw the biggest change, there were three things that made a really big difference. Visible leadership, the other one was about communication, and the third was about engagement. And I know that visible leadership has been, let's say, different over the last couple of years because people haven't been able to get out and walk about. But for a while, I worked for an organisation, a big organisation in the NHS, and there was something about which floor you got in and which floor you got off at. I don't know if anyone has ever experienced anything like that, but I worked on the 5th floor, and the big bosses worked on the 6th floor. And I'd get in and someone would smile at me and they'd press 6 and then I'd press 5 and they'd be like, I could see it going through their head. I didn't know you were a 5th floor person. And so what I used to do actually was I'd get in and I'd press 6 and we'd get out together and then I'd walk down. And it's all about how you feel. They didn't say anything. They didn't really do anything, but I knew how I felt. And these were the big bosses. So if you are a 6th floor person, then I would say be gracious and open and willing to engage and sit down next to you in the canteen and have lunch. You've probably seen the photos of the Pope having lunch in the canteen. And I would say to myself, if you can do that and role model it and be that person, not only will you learn so much about your organization that you actually never knew, but it's not just about people moaning and griping, it's about ideas for improvement. It's about, things that you really do want to know about, because otherwise you wouldn't. So I don't see it as a threat. I see it as an opportunity, going back to what we were saying before, but it is an intentional decision and you have to get buy-in from those around you. And you have to have capacity in your HR department, because when you give people the opportunity to speak up, they will. And what you don't want is for then there to be a blockage, because as HR is overwhelmed with the things people have spoken up about, and then people will think, I spoke up, nothing happened, something bad might happen to me. So it's a circular process of speak up, listen up, follow up, speak up, listen up, follow up. And that's just 5 years of work down into 6 words, basically.
So there's an interesting question here, I think I'd like to get your take on. Can people on opposite sides of the political spectrum work together on contentious issues? What are your experiences of that?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I wouldn't say they were opposite sides, but when my last spell in the civil service, I worked for 6 months for the coalition. And I can tell you, civil servants, I was in a senior leadership team, exec team in a big department. We were thinking, oh my God, how's this going to work? But actually, what happened was that there was mutual respect for the passion that both sides had for making shifts and improvements, and a generosity of spirit that found the best in both sides, and what that led to was a highest, not a lowest common denominator outcome. And the risk, of course, is that you paper over the cracks and it's superficial, and what you get is a lowest common denominator outcome. Or the much more obvious one, which is you've got, either private or public vitriol.
Thank you for sharing that. Jeff, perhaps a question for you. So an integral part of the justice system is an equal right to legal representation. As impartial defenders of the law, is there value in representing companies with whose values and morals we do not agree?
It's a brilliant question, actually, and as somebody who might currently be our Prime Minister said, an intelligent person can make a case for anything. And I think that's true, and it really depends on the context here. one of the things that motivated me, as I mentioned earlier, to be interested in justice was to read about the French avocat who defended Carlos the Jackal. And, I started off thinking, how on earth can he do that? And the answer, of course, is that if Carlos the Jackal didn't have representation, he couldn't have been convicted. So you can take on any mandate in the right context in accordance with some idea of morality. But I think the other element of that question is that, and it's one of the great simplifications of the legal profession. I don't spend my time protecting people's rights in court. That's not what most of us do. That's part of the legal profession. And I absolutely understand the point that if you're accused of criminality, or if your human or civil rights are impinged, absolutely that you need somebody to represent you. And that's the very origin, that's the foundation story of the legal profession, is to be able to defend people because you've got capabilities that they do not have in court. That doesn't apply at all in the commercial legal arena. And in the ordinary course of things, and again, I think the Ukrainian issue has shown quite clearly in the way that many law firms have sought to distance themselves from clients that they previously were content to have because the reputational stakes have changed, illustrates the fact that there isn't an ongoing obligation to fulfill every client's whim. There may be in particular mandates, but as a general proposition, no. So I think you've got to make that distinction between the sort of personal human rights, criminal type issues where there is a principle of access to justice, and the sort of commercial big business where I can choose to represent somebody or not. It's not a question of whether they deserve it. It's just entirely a matter for me whether I'm comfortable doing it. And because I have that choice, my firm has that choice, and other law firms have that choice, comes back to your point. We have agency. And actually, the senior partner of Clifford Chance said 18 months ago at a conference, he said, we do not need to be neutral in our choices of who we give our services to. And that is a very controversial statement in the legal profession, but it is absolutely true in my opinion.
Yeah, I agree.
It's quite misunderstood, isn't it, the rule of law and how it affects the day job of the commercial kind of corporate lawyer. So that would be a great PhD project.
Yes, title of the PhD, Ferrets in a Bag. We'll take a couple of questions from the audience before we go for drinks.
Julian Chamberlain and the Culp at Stewart's, and we specialise in litigation. Just picking up on that last theme, and indeed some of the issues we faced with the Ukraine situation. Whilst you can always choose to decline the next instruction from your client, under our current legal principle, notably the entire contract principle, it's rather difficult to cease acting for a client you're already acting for, whose values you now feel you've departed from. And I'm interested to hear if the panel have any views on whether that aspect of the law and the associated regulatory position change.
Sarah, is this something for you?
Well, we have seen offboarding invented, haven't we? We've talked for many years about onboarding within our profession. Offboarding seems to be invented now. I mean, it's really easy when a client is sanctioned, isn't it, to say you can no longer act for them. But if you just have a feeling that maybe someone is funding Putin's war and therefore you don't want to act for them, it's a little bit harder. I don't know that much about how law firms are tackling that, but if the press stories are to be believed, then people are stepping down from acting on professional clients in the absence of those clients being sanctioned. I don't know if there's anyone else in the audience. Ian's just left, hasn't he? I was going to ask Ian.
He has a dinner. It wasn't because of the question.
Yeah. Does anybody else have any views on the challenges there for law firms and sort of changing their mind about a client?
A lot of law firms have recently have a more focus on ESG. How has that affected on, in regards to earlier, Jeff, you said about the personal use and your what your clients, how has that affected in regards to ESG?
Well, I mean, it's very consistent with what we've been talking about. I mean, we've perhaps been talking obliquely, but an awful lot of what we've been talking about is sustainability, if you like, and you know, some of these choices that we need to make in relation to whether we want to act for a client or don't want to act for a client are about their position on ESG and whether they are contributing to solving the challenges the world faces or whether they're causing those challenges. And you know, there's obviously a range of, so much a range of opinions, but there's a range of positions on this, and it comes back to these sort of slightly tangential discussions about access to justice and the right to representation and things like that. And it comes back to this the sort of instinctive neutrality of the legal profession, as people think of themselves as being an adjunct to their clients rather than making choices about those. But you know, I think the ESG movement is really throwing that into sharp relief and making people think about those choices. And the point Sue made about alignment of values, it's now completely commonplace when our clients come to us and ask us to you know, reply to an RFP for work, that they inquire just as much about our values as our capabilities. And so I think your question is sort of bang on the money.
Yeah, and I think there's another element, we haven't seen this come to the fore yet, but I predict it will happen. We talked a bit about clients as backdoor regulators, but also insurers, PI insurers are quite influential as backdoor regulators. The most valuable asset any law firm really owns is its professional indemnity insurance, and insurers are becoming very concerned about their own ESG credentials, and they're asking more questions of law firms at PI renewal time about the kind of work that law firms do for which kind of clients, how they're training their own lawyers to spot climate change related risks and that kind of thing. So I can see that there'll be an ESG related pressure through the insurance world as well.
I'll take a final question, which was just here earlier, and then we will draw this to a close.
Okay.
It was you.
Yeah, I was just interested to hear thoughts in sort of equality and diversity context, because I feel like that's one area where there's a real stifling of creativity and quite flat gestures that come out of these conversations that happen periodically. Why is it that there's, and it's not just law firms, I think it's the corporate world, generally the private sector, that when it comes to sort of like feminist values, anti-racist values, that it's almost like we don't know how to develop and enact those values. We just kind of get stuck in the same place.
Can I just say something about that? So I was looking at the principles earlier, and I completely agree that when it comes to the principles for the profession, it's about encouraging equality, diversity, and inclusion. I think that's so weak in my view, because it should be about setting goals and targets and, you know, really looking to see how you know what it's like to work in an organisation. I gave evidence to the Women and Equalities Committee about sexual harassment, and there was a statistic that, you know, 50% of women believe that they've experienced sexual harassment in the workplace, and often the leaders of organisations don't actually believe or know that it's existing. So there's a mismatch there. And so I take it in terms of what are people saying? How are you asking them? Are you giving them opportunities to do anonymous feedback, 360s, staff survey results? And that's just about the people in the organisation. Then there's something about how does that work, you know, into the wider society as well. But I think until firms actually recognise that these are problems for their own workforce, they're not going to then be able, just as Sue was saying about that sort of blinkered view of like, let's just pretend it's not happening. I think it's absolutely key that you have really good diversity in the leadership and the management, because that's when you're going to get people with different perspectives and you're going to get better decision making. But it's also when people who are very senior, who are from a broader range of society, if they're experiencing harassment and negative behaviours at that senior level, then they'll know that it's happening to other people in the organisation too. So I do think that there's so much more that organisations can do, and it goes back to then attracting talent, because people will want to work in organisations where they feel safe and they feel that they're going to be, able to bring their whole self to work.
So, Jeff, anything else you'd like to add? I guess in our conversation, we talked quite a bit about climate change and some political issues like Brexit or Ukrainian invasion. I mean, is EDI different in terms of values or purpose?
Well, I think it's part of a bigger mix. I've mentioned the SDGs earlier, which some people talk about as the kind of the business plan for the world. But you look at the depth of social issues that we face, and indeed the risk that in focusing on the environmental stuff, we forget to put social issues hand in hand, and unless we do that, we will get perverse outcomes. So for me, it sits at a number of different levels. The most basic is, are the glass ceilings for anybody, and do you reflect the range of the businesses that your clients have if you're talking about a law firm? And if not, how do you drive that change in the organisation? And the evidence suggests that you need about 30% of the leadership group to represent, whether it's a gender or a race or whatever it is background, that's different from the typical pale male and stale one, in order for that to really start to drive the sorts of changes that we've been hearing about. So that for me is kind of level one. Where that then gets really interesting is where you understand the much bigger lever that you can pull in any sort of organisation. And again, this is about the company that you choose to keep, with organisations that are trying to actively create an environment where more women can work on anything other than the shop floor, for example, where you can really genuinely see that your clients are trying to remove slave labour and child labour from their supply chains. And I think they're much more difficult, because they're not quantified, they're very difficult to evidence. But, if you were really looking at the value of equality, then, that's a very big concept, and where that starts and stops in any organisation, I think, is an active leadership choice. And as more law firms are formed, as the world evolves, I think it would be really interesting to see whether more of the smaller startups aren't from a very specific point of view about how they want to use their legal prowess to create the future modern economy that we need, not the one that we've got now.
We scheduled this evening for an hour. We're now at an hour and 20, which is not unexpected given the breadth of the issues we had to cover. So I think I will bring this evening to a close. Can law firms have values? Well, yes, but as we've heard, it's all about the choices they make and how they decide to exercise their agency. So incredibly grateful to our panelists for a very thought-provoking evening, and to our guests for joining us. Those in the audience, do join us for a drink. Those online, do feel free to toast us at home. But thank you to Sue, Henrietta and Jeff for a wonderful evening.